Okay, well, friends and colleagues, thank you ever so much. We won't all rehearse the issues through COVID-19, but that's really the fundamental reason why we're meeting online tonight. I live in hope, as the person who is the president of the International Society for Science Religion at the moment, and my name is Michael Reiss, of eventually being able to take many of you who've won prizes both this year and indeed last year on behalf of the Society out to a real dinner. But this is nevertheless a good opportunity for us to meet together. And the only thing I really want to say before we get on with the heart of this evening is that genuinely the ISSR is extremely grateful to the funder TWCF, Templeton World Charity Foundation. We had the idea a few years ago of trying to persuade them to give us a grant to award a book prize. As often is the case, this takes quite a lot of negotiation, particularly because we wanted to push for a 5-year grant rather than their normal 3-year. And technically, it's not a grant to allow it to be for 5 years, but they have generously funded us for 5 years to do it. And also, ISSR fellows give a huge amount of time without being paid, including a number of the fellows in front of me at the moment. So both to our funders and to our fellows, I'm very, very grateful indeed. This is the second year in which we've had this prize. And I think, Fraser, I can now hand over to you.
Thank you very much. So there are 3 prize-winning books and we'll take them one by one. And that's largely what the meeting consists of. And we'll start, I think, with James W. Jones, the book I'm holding up, Living Religion, Embodiment Theology, and the Possibility of a Spiritual Sense. And we have various categories of books in the prize. This is a prize for a book which is for a general readership. And in a moment, I'll ask Jim to say something about it. Why he wrote it, what it's about, anything else he wants to say, but just sort of by way of lead into that. Jim says at the start it's a book about theology and psychology, and it is. But I think it's about a particular perspective on both, and the subtitle largely says it. In psychology, I think, Jim, you're largely drawing on the fairly recent psychology of embodiment, particularly embodied cognition, which I think is one of the interesting, exciting growth areas in psychology in the last 10 years or so, perhaps a bit more. And in terms of religion, I think you've got this long-standing interest in the possibility of a spiritual sense. So I think that's the sort of particular bit of psychology and the particular bit of religion that you've brought together in, I think, this fascinating book. So let me hand over to you to say something about it.
Well, look, I am deeply, deeply grateful to you all for this award. I'm retired. I've discovered that I don't have the bandwidth that I used to have to stay on top of all of the academic work I used to do. My wife and I have moved to a very splendid retirement community. And this was the best possible note to go out on, was this award. I belong to a lot of professional societies, but this is you are the colleagues in science and religion that I most respect. And to get an award from you at the end of feels like the end of my career, it was wonderful. And so thank you all very, very much. How did this come to be written? Fraser asked. Well, years ago, I heard about a lecture by Dan Dennett, and it was his usual anti-theological tirade based on his understanding of science. And I was told that somebody raised a question about whether someone might raise a question with him about the science that he was using. And he responded that no religious person knows enough science to challenge me. And I said, hey, wait a minute here. I've had courses in statistics and research design. I've done neuropsychological testing. I have all these colleagues and more behind you. And it made me very, very grumpy. And out of that grumpiness, I wrote a very, very grumpy book, refuting, at least criticizing the use of cognitive science and neuroscience by people who use it to debunk religion. The original title of that book was Debunking the Debunkers, but my editor didn't like that, so now it's called Can Science Explain Religion? But I was dissatisfied with that book because it's very negative in some ways. It's a critique of various people, but it doesn't offer a positive position. So I thought, well, I want to write a book about what are some of the positive contributions that neuroscience might make to understanding religion. And it was out of that desire that I wrote this book. The scientific basis of this book, Living Religion, is all of the psychological research, some of it neuroscience, brain scans, so on and so forth, some of it social science, about the close connection between motoric systems and cognitive systems, close connection both structurally and functionally. And so that knowing, all knowing in science and in religion is shaped by what we are doing. And there are some serious, it seems to me, there's some serious implications of that for theological epistemology and for a scientific understanding of religion. And that there are things we won't know if there are things we won't do. And there are some unhappy and controversial implications of this. And there's only one that I want to mention, and that is that knowledge in science, in theology, and in religion is a kind of skill. It requires practice. We learn how the brain works by learning to interpret certain tests and read certain slides. We learn that there's more realities beyond the immediate physical reality by engaging in disciplined spiritual practices like meditation and prayer and devotion and service to others. And there's an unhappy implication of this, and that is that there are some religious things a person won't know if they won't engage in those practices. And so let me, because what I really want is your feedback on this book. It's one of the reasons I write books, is to get into discussions with people and to get feedback. So let me stop there and let me listen to what some of your responses are.
Thanks very much, Jim. I guess one of the topics has been discussed endlessly in science and religion is about reductionism. And you mentioned Dan Dennett, and he's probably an archetypal reductionism. And I wonder if you can say something about how reductionism looks from the perspective of this book, and whether you think the psychology of embodiment, embodied cognition, that you've sort of taken as your scientific basis in this book, whether that changes the problem of reductionism that's dogged a lot of science and religion debate.
Well, there's two things that I say in the book, and one of them is I just sort of reprise a series of an argument that I've been having for 20 years probably about physicalism, and I have a very strong anti-physicalist bent, and which I've written about. I've shed much more ink than needs to be on that issue of reductionism, on physicalism, and that's certainly, and there's a chapter in this book about why I find physicalism rather unconvincing. But one of the things that it seems to me the embodied cognition, and I don't think of this as a book about embodied cognition actually, because it turns out that when I talk to colleagues in the psychology department and read more journals and articles, there are certain controversies about embodied cognition as a psychological system that I had no dog in that fight. You know, I just did not want to get into those things. But the research is very important. The research on the role of embodiment in human understanding, whether it yields a position that we would call embodied cognition. As I say, I'm I'm staying away from that because that's a specialist argument for cognitive scientists to conduct, and I'm not interested in conducting that argument. But one of the things that material, that research does, and I'm very clear about that in the book, is it pushes this in a pragmatic direction. And there's a kind of pragmatism in this book, and which I think is of it as an alternative to reductionism, as a way of understanding, to think about these things pragmatically, not in the sense of, well, if it works, it must be true. I don't think that's the case at all. But pragmatism in the sense of there are some things you won't know unless there are some things that you'll do. And so there is an anti-reductionist. There's always, everything I write, it's always got an anti-reductionist bend to it. And so, but I think an alternative is the kind of pragmatism that you find in the embodied cognition research.
Yeah. I'll just ask one more, if I may, and then I'll see if anyone else wants to come in. About the idea of a spiritual sense. I mean, spiritual is always a problematic adjective. And I wrote a book about spiritual healing, and of course, I wrestled a lot with what the adjective spiritual meant in the phrase spiritual healing. And I wonder if I can invite you to say a bit more about what you mean by spiritual when you talk about a spiritual sense.
Well, my definition was an awareness of a reality greater than the world of space and time that we ordinarily know. And the way I approached the issue of definition is to say, this is not a matter that can be settled by definition. And so I start off with 4 examples, and I'm not even sure I remember what they all are, but 4 examples of things that I think we would all agree were accounts of spiritual experience from different traditions and different times in history and so on and so forth. And I say the same thing that you just said. There's no way to give a definition that's useful. It's so abstract, it's not useful. A useful definition, and it's better to take examples and to work from examples. So I give some examples, and I use other examples of other kinds of information that we do this way. So for example, if you wanted to know what a fine wine was, a definition would not help you. You would taste some examples of wine that were fine and some that weren't, and then you would eventually learn to recognize hopefully what a fine wine was, or even something more simpler like flowers. If you give a definition, it probably doesn't cover everything. So it's better to sort of walk around the garden and say, these are examples of flowers, and these are examples that aren't flowers. And eventually a person would develop a sense, an ostensive sense of what constitutes a flower. It seems to me the same thing is true about spiritual experience. You give some examples and you say, all right, now, these are examples. It's not a definition. And so one of the things that, in terms of the interests of this book, one of the things I note about these examples are that people use the language of sense, use the language of sense. They use the language of something is seen or heard or smelled in some cases. So there's sense, but it's always qualified. If you read this, and anyone who knows this literature knows it, people say, yes, it was a vision, but it wasn't like seeing a tree, or I heard something, but it wasn't like hearing the person next to me. And so I understood something, but it was through a cloud of unknowing. And so there's this, you use the language of perception that psychologists are very familiar with. You use the language of sensation, but you qualify it. And one of the characteristics of these kind of discussions of a spiritual sense is it uses the language of sensation, but it qualifies it in some way. And that's the framework that I was using here. You're not going to get an ostensive definition that you can use and say, well, Is this a spiritual experience or is this isn't? I don't think there is such a definition, as you say. But I think there's a way of proceeding by way of case examples.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me see if anyone else would like to come in on Jim's book.
Yes, please. Question, comment, cries of pain and outrage. I don't know what to say.
If not, we can just move on, but there is an opportunity.
Pardon, I didn't hear what you said.
I think Fraser was simply saying it's an opportunity for people to comment, but we don't have to. Indeed, to be quite honest, I, for example, have read none of the 3 books. So it may be that many of us are now more likely to go away and read them now that they've won the prizes.
Yes.
If you do, please get back to me with feedback over, because I really treasure the feedback.
Right. Okay, so let's move on. And the book we'll come to next is a cheerful title, The Joy of Religion, by Ariel Glucklich. And I'm going to hand over now to one of the other members of the panel of judges, Ed Larson. So over to you, Ed.
Unmute. Well, I wish to issue my congratulations on this book, the way it so neatly enriches a discussion that, as you mentioned, various ideas of the sociology of religious and the ideas of group formation, how this supplements this. And so I think the order is that we turn it over to you to say something about it, and then I will add something after that.
Okay, sounds good. Like Jim, thank you for the honor of the award. I'm actually trained as a religion scholar straight up. My degree is in Sanskrit and Indian studies. And I think the subscription to American Scientist in the 1980s is what got that bug going for me. 20 years exactly ago, I came out with a book called Sacred Pain, which collected data. It began by collecting data on the prevalent use of pain, voluntarily self-inflicted pain in religions all across the world. And I set out to understand it, not from the point of view of discourse, in other words, what the herders are telling me, but what it is that unite them all. And in the process of researching this, I discovered that they really enjoy the pain, that you encounter statements about how pain actually leads to elevated moods and even pleasure. And that was 20 years ago, mind you. So I spent the last 2 decades digging into pleasure and was struck, first of all, by the fact that it's a subject that has not been covered in religious studies at all. Pleasure in world religions, probably because the word pleasure is usually associated with sensory pleasures. At the same time, I was also struck by the prevalence, the plurality, the diversity, and the ambiguity of pleasure in religious life, both discourse, scriptures, biographies, and so forth, and in practice, in rituals, and so forth. The ambiguity refers to the fact that pleasure in its diverse forms is often promoted and highly valued, but at the same time, very often excoriated, especially by the Western traditions, Christianity and Islam. Judaism is more nuanced where it comes to enjoying life, I have to say. I hope I'm not offending anybody. I was also struck by the uselessness of the language that is used in myself. I'm trained in Sanskrit and Hindi. My native language is Hebrew. I studied Arabic, Latin, some other languages, European languages. The uselessness of the original language to understand what is meant by a pleasure word when it is written or uttered. So I adopted an analytical framework that I considered behavioral adaptive. By framework, I mean criteria for evaluating the pleasure, not on the basis of the word that is used to describe it. For example, joy versus, say, for example, ananda in Sanskrit, or simcha in Hebrew, and so forth. Those words don't convey what the pleasure actually is, how it feels and how it serves. Whereas the behavioral adaptive criteria I found to be more useful, and those are divided into pleasures that are novelty, mastery, and play. And it turns out, exploring that particular framework, that religions play a role in cultural and social evolution in the way that they modulate, refine, control, deepen, prolong states of pleasure. Okay, and so the basic pleasure, the novelty pleasure, which we are hardwired to experience, is the one that's usually excoriated because apparently it does not serve the unification of groups in evolutionary times. On the other hand, from motivational points of view, for motivational purposes, okay, a mastery pleasure emerged in history as a kind of pleasure by means of which we enjoy those activities that promote the group, that promote the cohesiveness of the group: patience, altruism, self-control, self-discipline. And those kinds of pleasures emerge in particular historical times, I claim, around the world. I explored them in Greece and in India and in ancient Israel, but they could be explored in other places as well, but not so explicitly. So that's mastery pleasure playing a major role in the competitiveness of groups. Then there's play pleasure. The third pleasure is the most complex at all. It has very strong philosophical, cognitive dimensions. It's the sort of pleasure that one can only enjoy having acquired mastery pleasure. For example, the obedience to rules, the acceptance of rules that govern play require a level of mastery, but it's fantasy. It's counterfactual. It allows the players to transgress boundaries between what is real and what is fantasy, or if not transgress, accept the simultaneous presence of that which is fantastic and that which is real. And those kinds of pleasures feature most prominently within religious studies, most interestingly, in mystical states. For example, Plotinus. So I investigate the writings of Plotinus as the author who, in a sense, sort of fertilized the soil for a whole range of Christian mystics as they basically explore that kind of play pleasure in mystical states. The same thing happens in India, but I didn't go so much into that. So overall, that's the design and the direction of the book. It's evolutionary in scope, the benefit of groups, but it rests for evidence on empirical, on the ground religious discourse and practices.
If I can ask you to expand a bit, wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. If you could expand a little bit on what you say about the church sect theory and how this impacts differently among a dominant, sort of mainstream, you might call it, denomination, whether it be the Anglican Church in England or the dominant Muslim church, Islamic church in Iran, or even the Baptist in Georgia or the American South, versus groups like the Ashkenazi Jews, maybe, or the Amish, or other small, but they're often very cohesive groups that are rock solid in their staying power and the adherence to people within the group, to that group.
Okay, as you all probably know, the church sect argument is that the smaller, more sectarian the group, the more likely it is to digress from the norms that govern the broad culture in which religious denominations function. So that the argument is that a religious denomination, for example, Presbyterians in America, are more likely to conform to certain values that characterize American secular culture or other dominant criteria, as opposed to, for example, sectarian groups within, for example, Christian denominations, which are more likely to diverge from those norms. As far as hedonics are concerned, the element of hedonics was not really explored very carefully in that divergence, okay? The elements that were explored were, for example, values, in the question of abortion, the question of religious significance of particular rituals and so forth. Hedonics means that, the digression or divergence from the mainstream for small groups implies harsher hedonic practices. That is to say, self-sacrificing, austerities, and along with that, the promotion of mastery pleasure as the criterion that justifies those practices and unifies those who are members of those sectarian groups, okay? Whereas in the larger denominational groups, the emphasis on mastery is more mute, fewer examples of austerity. So that's the hedonic addition to the church sect theory, hypothesis.
And how would you equate this with Rodney Stark's theories?
Well,
I think you in a way supplement them, but maybe you partially overturn them as well.
I did not really intend to overturn the Rodney Stark argument and other more economically oriented arguments is the interest of groups to enlarge themselves, to grow. And in the interest of growing, there has to be the softening of criteria by means of which the group prospers and grows and promotes itself. Whereas my argument is different. The criticism of my argument would be that, in a sense, it's somewhat tautological, perhaps, in the sense that I chose, for example, Anabaptists or some groups in India that you might not be familiar with that are already self-defined as more austere, without actually conducting research as to the demographic trend in covering over a period of years. In other words, what is their interest? Are they interested in staying small? Are they interested in expanding? In other words, I use the theoretical snap in time. And so I think methodologically speaking, there's something missing there. in order to fully challenge Stark.
I invite other people to ask some questions as well before I add on any more. Go ahead, yes. James?
Good, okay. I'm very interested in this topic from a clinical perspective, and also from a personal perspective, because of some pretty serious back surgery a couple years ago, I've gone from treating chronic pain patients to being a chronic pain patient. And when you talk about, and I've seen videos and so on and so forth of people engaging in activities, whipping themselves, and all kinds of things that we would normally associate with being in pain. But if you look at the people, and I don't know what if you hook them up to a lot of psychophys equipment, what you get, but they certainly don't look like they're in pain. They certainly look like they're experiencing pleasure. And so this is a kind of simplistic question, but I'm very interested in it for the reasons I just gave. If it produces pleasure, is it really pain?
Well, that's a good question. Pain is as much a cultural and psychological event.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And according to some theorists, anthropologists like Richard Sosis, for example, they're signaling. And in the act of signaling, they're promoting perhaps their social capital, which is gratifying on some levels. And it also acts as a unifying, for example, in tribal studies, acts as an example of unifying behavior. And in the Sacred Pain book, I explore that. In this book, by austerities, I don't really refer to actual self-hurtings, such as, for example, severe piercing, suspension with hooks and so forth. I don't really look at that. What I do look at is fasting, vigils, sleeping on the ground, submitting yourself to cold or heat, those kind of things. So for example, if you think of Qumran, the community at Qumran, and you compare it to mainstream Jerusalem-based life of the Jews, the Hellenized Jews, it was much more severe, but without actual self-inflicted pain.
And that's where, as I understand it, groups, I grew up among the Amish, and they deprived themselves of a whole variety of things. I guess you could say the same things about the old school Seventh-day Adventist. In America, you could run through a variety, the Hutterites in Montana, variety of different groups. And yet the one theory I always knew, and which we were talking about, is that it creates a greater group solidarity. But I also found just what you experienced, and that would be a deprivation. But when I read your book, I was really struck with thinking about these people, about the mastery sense of pleasure that these people experienced. They weren't whipping themselves on their back, but they were doing without a lot of modern conveniences. And there was this sort of, it wasn't a big smile on their face, because most of these people, when I knew them, didn't smile very much, but a deep sense of mastery pleasure. And I assume that's in large part what you're talking about here, as opposed to the pleasure that may come from whipping yourself or other sorts of infliction of direct pain.
Right, and you don't get the psychotropic language associated with that. As you know, today you have the modern primitives. There's the modern primitive church in the United States, consisting of about 4,000 members, who self-suspend by hooks and body modifications, severe piercings, and so forth. And that they're following the god of neurotransmitters. And they're consciously controlling the events that they actually characterize as neurological, brain-based. What they're experiencing, of course, is elevated states of consciousness, which Jim raises the question that you raised, the physiological event and the quote spiritual language. Where is the boundary between them? In this book, I don't look at that at all.
Other questions and comments from others? Well, I personally viewed this as really supplementing what I've always read and always known about the role of some of these activities. And again, I'm not talking about the direct pain infliction, but the role of othering that's important, and the role of differentiating, but when you're adding this sense of mastery pleasure, it just deepened my understanding of what would be the variety of, if we go back to Henry James, of understanding the variety of religious experiences. So I want to commend you for broadening my thoughts on this issue. I do want to make sure, if anybody else wants to say anything, I want to make sure I give them time. But again, I want to thank you for it. I thought you sort of captured it. If I may just read one sentence, you captured it so many times. One thing I liked about your book is that you had a clear thesis, and you kept bringing the reader back to that thesis and explaining to the reader why the next thing you were going to say relates to that thesis. And I honestly don't think enough writers do that. They just presume, for some ridiculous reason, that the reader knows as much as they know and will be bored by that repetition. But us readers who aren't in that area, who don't know that area, need that constant return. So right smack dab in the middle, I finally settled myself into your thesis, and then you bring up chapter 6, which is right smack dab in the middle, halfway through. A broad theoretical argument underlying this book is that hedonistic regulation in culture context was useful for the survival and prospering of groups in evolutionary historical time, and that religious beliefs and actions played a major role. And then you go back into it. Well, you're repeating what you've already said, but you're really centering and focusing at least this one particular reader. So I thank you for your writing style as well, for helping to communicate your point.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I just want to toss one thing out there, and maybe you can help me with this in your response. And that is, in every religious tradition, bar none, the highest, the Mount Everest of religious experience, the mystical or the intimately spiritual, it doesn't matter if you're Hindu, a Buddhist, a Muslim, it doesn't matter. It feels good. It feels good. The height, again, the Everest of spiritual experience in the great traditions, it is accompanied by a feeling of pleasure, joy, bliss, ecstasy, whatever you want to call it. It's not boring. There are moments, of course, that are frightening. Okay, there are moments of frustration. You read Teresa of Avila, the closer she gets to Christ, the more she suffers at his absence, right? He's playing hide and seek with her. But when she does gain that moment, it's blissful. And given that fact, why is it that the incredibly rich, diverse scholarship of religion in all the different subdisciplines really have not really focused that much on the pleasure of the spiritual experience?
Well, I'll open that up to all the other religious scholars. I think that one thing I'd throw in is that it does somewhat. I mean, there's a study of the dervish and among Islam, and there's certainly been some recent study about various some of the more extreme Islamic sects getting into this. There certainly is some literature about some of the religious groups, the more ecstatic religious groups in America, the Protestant ones. You can see it even in your Presbyterians that you keep claiming are the middle of the road. Well, that depends on which Presbyterians you're talking about. There's some Presbyterians in the PCA church that are pretty darn ecstatic in their activities, as opposed to in the Presbyterian Church USA. And I think you see that in Anglicanism in America. You got the Anglican Church. You get some of that in the Anglican Church and the Anglican monasteries, as opposed to the more broad-based Episcopal Church. I believe that's true in England as well. You, of course, get that in developments in American pre-Vatican II Catholicism that's going on in America right now, and in the charismatic movements of certain, within certain churches. So I think there is some study, but I agree that this has not been a, perhaps because most people may have a hard time understanding it as religious. I've seen also some studies, some PhD studies on the Hutterites in Montana that capture what you're talking about beautifully. So I do think it's there, and I would turn it over to Michael, who may have also some comments on this.
I was just going to say this is riveting, but Fraser's probably going to say the same thing. Sadly, Jim and Ed, and thank you so much for the discussion. We're probably going to have to move over to the third book, but thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
So indeed, congratulations, Ariel, and thank you, Ed. So we move on to our third book, which is by Tom Aechtner, Media and Science, Religion, Conflict, Mass Persuasion and the Evolution Wars. And I'm going to hand over to another of the panel of judges, Russell Raymond.
Thank you, Fraser. I wonder if, just picking up on that previous conversation, the influence perhaps of some of the discussion of Otto, maybe, the sort of sense of mysterium, tremendum et fascinans, whether that in some sense doesn't give space for the joy, for the pleasure element there. But we move on to Tom's book, and as Fraser said, media and science, from the joy of religion to a topic which some of us maybe groan when we confront evolution wars. Once again, no goodness, more on science and religion, evolution, and yet this book, what I think that the panel felt unanimously was that this book has something new to say about this topic, and approaches it in a really fascinating, interesting way, drawing on different resources from persuasion theory, engaging mass media, really opening new perspectives on what some of us may have thought was something of a conversation which has had its time. So I'm going to invite Tom to say a few words about the book, and be really, I mean, I would love to hear something of the genesis of the book, of how you came to engage this topic in this way.
Well, thank you very much. I also enjoyed that conversation about Ariel's book, and probably would have loved to continue that as well. So thanks for that. But I'd also like to thank the ISSR and especially the review panel, who have spent significant time reading and reviewing books and somehow decided to award a prize to my book. And I suppose in answer to that question, that first question, this book really started with my asking why the disputes, known as the evolution wars, persist, because, there's been so much research into it. We've actually, I was sort of confounded by the continuation of anti-evolutionism, creationism, and intelligent design, and the debate around evolution, especially when so many scholars of theology and history, philosophy, scientists have long said that there doesn't need to be any conflict between religion and biological evolution. Yes, I was still encountering people and people who were advocating for creationism and intelligent design. And so I really got interested in sort of understanding why the evolution wars persist despite all of the scholarly research, really deconstructing anti-evolutionism. And in any case, I landed on analyzing evolution wars, mass media, and persuasion. And I came to this focus at first because there were similarities by design in anti-evolutionist communications and propaganda of the First and Second World Wars, which I discuss in the book. And so there was creationists were actually taking and mimicking First and Second World propaganda on purpose to persuade people of the evils of evolutionary theory. And so I came really through the lens of propaganda and saying, look, it's interesting that there's so many similarities between one sort of persuasive communication strategy and the communications in the evolution wars. And so while some literature had hinted at the importance of evolution wars media influences in the perpetuation of anti-evolutionism and the evolution wars, there remained what I thought was a need for research really dedicated to examining the persuasive mechanisms and the prospective outcomes of these sorts of communications. So this was the gap that the book really has sought to address as it aims to identify numerous persuasive features of media attacking and defending evolution while considering the implications of evolution wars persuasion efforts. And the idea was to use modern persuasion research to move beyond just polemically assessing fact claims in anti-evolutionist and counter-creationist messages. And that's because, as I try to show, I think in the text, the importance of evolution wars media argumentation really, I think, rests not merely in rationale or evidences, but in the persuasive dynamism of Darwin skeptic and pro-evolutionist communications. So in terms of mass communications and the evolution wars, the book argues that really the crux of the matter is not necessarily whether these materials are academically sound or cogent. Instead, what is really important in an age, as we see today, where non-experts can actively refute specialists, scientists, through any number of mediums, and be successful in doing so, is the degree to which messages about sciences may be persuasive to audiences. So not necessarily their cogency, but their persuasive attributes. And so the book surveys, a multi-year collection of mass communications generated by prominent anti-evolutionist organizations, as well as leading supporters of biology, as I call the pro-evolutionists. And the mass media produced by leading Darwin skeptics and the rivals are examined through the lens of persuasion research, with a focus on the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, to explore how people make decisions in response to mass communications and the type of heuristics that you see in the media messages. And the emphasis is on the expression of cues, sort of cognitive mental shortcuts, which have been demonstrated to function in media as sort of subtle but effective means of influencing public opinion. And then the book also visits how these persuasive cues can resonate with the core sociocultural and moral values maintained by specific target audiences. And in the end, what I at least thought were new insights into how these communications may influence audiences, regardless of whether researchers have unanimously concluded that there should be no religion evolution conflict, or whether scholars have argued that such communications are factually spurious. And so, because when it comes to how people make decisions about publicly contested science, like vaccines and evolution, the ways in which science communications are delivered can be, in my view, as important as their factual bases.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. If I may, it's one of those unfair questions that asks you to talk about something that you didn't talk about in the book, but it's sort of taking it forward in a way. I wonder how. I mean, we live in a society in which sort of mass media is changing, and we have social media, online communication. Can you maybe talk to that changing scenario? Do you think? I mean, are the evolution wars persisting in similar ways, or does that dynamic differ in this changing environment, do you think?
It's really a key question. And in short, the answer is yes, it is moving with the times. So what's really important is, so often when I talk to people who don't know what I research, when I mention, people ask who I research, and I say, oh, I study counter-science movements, including creationists and intelligent design theorists. And usually the response that I get is that these people are living in the past, they're antiquated, that, they're not moving with the times. But historically and in the present day, let's say creationists and anti-evolutionists have always been quick to take on new technologies of communication. They've adapted to new methods of communication far quicker than have pro-science communicators. And this is a trend we don't just see in anti-evolutionism. We see it amongst an anti-vaccination or vaccine hesitant community, and we see it amongst climate change denialists. Those who tend to be, let's say, science skeptical or to be opposed to consensus science are often the quickest to take on these new technologies. And it's just been the same way for creationist intelligent design theorists. So they're completely active on Twitter and on new social media, Facebook. They're the first to take on, and it's always researchers like myself and pro-science advocates that are 3 steps behind. And we see that now in the pandemic. So we've seen that in the pandemic where vaccine misinformation and people spreading vaccine misinformation, it's coming from a very small minority group of people, is spreading at significantly greater rates, and is being spread by these people on the new media. Same is true for anti-evolutionism, and the scientists and the science advocates are well behind. And these same sort of cues that I mentioned in this book, I have now identified, for instance, in the anti-evolutionist mass media produced here in Australia. And so we see the exact same sorts of mechanisms at play also in those new media.
Okay, yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned a couple of times, and I know this is something that you're working on currently, the context of vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaccination campaign. Is that the right word? I'm not sure. But I mean, I'm wondering again if you could draw some lessons from that longer history of the evolution wars in our current context with the pandemic and the reactions amongst how can I put this, sort of scientific and religious, those sorts of perspectives that combine perspectives that are from science and religion in the context of the pandemic and the context of response to calls for vaccination, etc.
Yeah, so I actually shifted somewhat to studying vaccine hesitancy well before the pandemic. And the reason was because I started seeing, so I started with propaganda, which led me to persuasion research and studying anti-evolutionism and then the pro-evolutionists. And then from propaganda to from the anti-evolutionists, I started to see some significant similarities in the type of messaging and persuasion strategies of other counter-science movements. So I saw it first with climate change denial, because some anti-evolutionist materials were skeptical of climate change, and also anti-vaccine mass media, because there were actually a few articles from young Earth creationists that also questioned vaccines, that said, well, you know, vaccination is also not really a proven science. It's just things. But so because the anti-evolutionists had mentioned specifically climate change, because only God can lead, you know, to the end of the world, you know, we can't influence that. So climate science, like evolutionary theory, is not a true empirical science. And they had mentioned vaccines. I started to look more closely at climate change denial mass media, but really landed on the vaccine mass media well before the pandemic. And there are a lot of similarities that we see across these science skeptical messaging. And for instance, with the anti-vaccine media, I assumed that appeals to fear, arousal of fear about, let's say, vaccine side effects would be the primary sort of message, this primary sort of rhetorical persuasive message, and it wasn't. By far, the most significant persuasive element in anti-vaccination media, which appears in more than 70% of all the articles that I looked at, was sort of distrust narrative around the scarcity principle, that you cannot trust the government, and primarily that something is being hidden from us. So there's a conspiracy. It's a conspiratorial sort of messaging that, you know, something is being hidden from us. The true dangers, even though the dangers are being mentioned, the real issue isn't the dangers. The real issue is that the dangers are being hidden by us, by a corrupt cabal of individuals. And you see that across science skeptical media, including in anti-evolutionism. So in a lot of anti-evolutionist media, one of the claim is, look, pro-young Earth creationist or pro-intelligent design data is being hidden, but it's being hidden by these evolutionary secular scientists. And that conspiratorial narrative, which is now so front and center in the pandemic, really underlies, I think, a lot of science skeptical mass media. It's a distrust narrative. You cannot distrust the expert or trust the experts and government and all these sorts of things, and something is being hidden from us. And I think that's a really strong message in relation to, even now, let's say, the rejection, people's hesitancy around vaccines. It's not necessarily just fear. It's actually correlated much stronger, if there's anything, from religious people to non-religious people. The thing that connects hesitant cohort, a vaccine hesitant cohort, from different political backgrounds, from religion and non-religious backgrounds, is distrust. And that's what actually is being put in the forefront of a lot of anti-vaccination, but even also anti-evolutionary mass media.
Thanks very much. We're moving towards the end of our time. Let's see if anyone else would like to come in quickly on this fascinating book. Ed.
I'll just very quickly ask, what would be your prescription then for dealing with this? Since you describe it, and your book does a beautiful job of showing this as a broad-based phenomenon that's as true in Australia as it is in the United States or in Pakistan or wherever you want to look. It seems to be in the nature of the human race.
So, you know, in short, there's no easy solution. And most of the research that has analyzed for decades how to influence people's opinions and behaviors around science to change their views when they're already skeptical of science. Let's say in the case of vaccines, most attempts to change people's minds fail. There are things that work better. in the long term. But one of the things that I suggest, and that I have suggested to people who are making decisions around, let's say, messaging vaccines and that sort of thing, is actually be less cognitively naive. What I mean by that is most academics and scholars believe that if we just continue to put forward more facts on evolution, or put more facts on vaccines, that people will accept it. And all of the data also shows that is not effective, and it can even backfire. And so I always say, don't be cognitively naive, and maybe use some of the same sorts of strategies positively that you see in the counterscience movement. So the counterscience movement really plays upon source cues. So anytime anyone has any sort of degree, whether it's fake or not, it's mentioned constantly. Refer to the credibility of the people who are advocating pro-science, and perhaps use some of the strategies, refer to social consensus and scientific consensus more. These are some of the things that anti-evolutionists and anti-vaccinationists are using in full. And don't be naive about the fact that sometimes try to be a little bit more persuasive. Tell more stories, perhaps, than you do tell about facts.
Thank you. And anyone else quickly before we wrap things up? Or Russell, anything else you want to say?
Could I just ask about the vaccine issue, because I found that very fascinating, because obviously there is the controversy over vaccines, which has got nothing to do with religion, in the sense that, you know, the conspiracy issue and the distrust of the governments, etc. But one has the impression that, especially in America, there is a more direct link with religion, because, you know, we have all the images of churches where they refuse to wear masks because they will be protected in the church or whatever. So could you say something about the specifically religious element in the vaccine controversy?
Sure. So we're moving beyond the book. There is a chapter in the book that relates to vaccine.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. So just in terms of my own research, so I'm got a publication right now in press referring to religion and vaccine hesitancy, but that's specifically to Australia, but I think it has wider implications. Well, one of the things we found, it was based on sociological data. One of the things we found is that there wasn't actually, in Australia at least, a significant correlation between religion, so religious identity and religious affiliation, and vaccine hesitancy. And that's likely because a lot of religious people are pro-vaccine, so it washes out statistically. However, we did find there was connections between religion and vaccine, in the sense that there was, if you got a group of vaccine hesitant individuals, the most vaccine hesitant individuals, there's still somewhat a weaker correlation that you'll find more religious people in that cohort than in the average population. But what we found was that the most resistant people to vaccine in Australia divided along two lines: non-religious and religious. The religious tend to be religious conservatives, and they tend to be politically conservative. So there was a stronger link between religion and conservatism and political conservatism. And then the other, I call it a bifurcated vaccine hesitant group. The other group was non-religious and tended to be what I call non-religious progressives. So they totally split on ethics, so sexual ethics. They completely split on, and they tended to split politically. And so, you know, in the US, I suspect you're seeing religious conservatives mapping onto politically conservative views, and that's where you see the expression. I still think you'll probably see religion washed out across the country a little bit more, because there's a lot of religious people who are happy to get vaccinated. So you're seeing, I think you're seeing it connected with religious conservatism and political conservatism on one end, and sort of liberal ethics and more liberal politics or progressive politics on the other end. But what connects them, again, they both have significant distrust in government and less trust in scientists and experts.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, I think we should leave that there. Fascinating book, Tom. Thanks very much, and congratulations. And this is a discussion that could run a long time, but not tonight. So I'll hand back to Michael to wrap things up, if I may.
I mean, only to echo, first of all, many thanks and congratulations to particularly the 3 prize winners, Ariel, Jim, Tom, and thank you to all of those of you on the panel, both those who spoke this evening and others. And I think this will end up being on the ISSR website. It's the first time we've done this, but I do hope I end up seeing all of you face to face at some point before too long. Fraser, thanks for organising tonight. Good night, everybody.
And let me just add, we have another book prize next year. We've had only 2 of the 5 years, so it's not urgent yet, but in the new year, we'll be putting out a call for nominations. So you might like to be thinking, what are the exciting books that have come out in the last year or 2 you want to nominate? We'd be grateful. Thank you.